Alright, let me move along. Marx. A couple of years back they took a poll in England. They asked people, who is the most influential thinker of the last 1,000 years? Not the last 10 or the last 100, the last 1,000 years. The runaway winner by streets. Karl Marx. I'm sure you all know a good deal about Karl Marx. Let me just recall what Friedrich Engels said at Marx's graveside at his funeral. Just as Darwin discovered the laws of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of the development of human history, the simple fact hitherto concealed by an outgrowth of ideology that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing, before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, etc., that therefore the production of the immediate material means, and consequently the degree of economic development attained by a given people or during a given epoch, form the foundation upon which the state institutions, the legal conceptions, art and even religion of the people concerned have been evolved, and in the light of which they must therefore be explained instead of vice versa, as has hitherto been the case. Now, I don't know if you made sense of that somewhat labyrinthine passage, but the basic idea is very simple. You've all heard it. The material forces of history determine everything else, including art, politics, law, religion, and all the rest of it. Religion is the opium of the people. It's an instrument of class struggle. It is a sign of man's alienation and his ignorance from his true self. Marx is a humanist, as well as being a child of the Enlightenment in many other ways. The belief in progress, the belief in science, the belief in the perfectibility of man. There is one terribly dangerous idea lurking in Marx's scenario, and that is utopianism. The idea that all of the wrongs of the world, all of the injustice, all of the oppressions, the crime, the suffering, is all the result of faulty social organisation and of class struggle. And that if we could eliminate the causes of class struggle, namely private property, we could organise a world in which everyone got a fair shake, everyone got a fair amount of the cake, so to speak. And as Marx said, we could fish in the morning, hunt in the afternoon, raise cattle in the evening and philosophise in the night time. A charming prospect, is it not, ladies and gentlemen? A charming prospect. And in a way we might wish that it could be true, but of course we know better. Wherein lies the danger? Once men's minds are gripped by the idea that a perfect world is possible, then almost anything can be justified. If you seriously believe that if we just need to reorganise the social machinery and we will end up with a perfectly equitable and fair world, then almost any price would indeed be worth paying.
The following is a reading of Communism Is Not Conservative by Zoltanus and Momcilo Nevesky. Thanks to the insanity of the internet, a new phenomena of conservative communism, formerly known as patriotic socialism, is now a thing. Frankly, on face value, this is just so ridiculous it shouldn't even be addressed. Unfortunately, there are personalities like Infrared, also known as Hawes, who have managed to grow a large following, who believe in a highly warped Frankenstein version of Marxism. We now have to contend with political retardation, conservative communism, or as he calls it, capital C communism. One of the key tenets of this monstrosity of capital C communism is the insane idea that communism is inherently conservative, patriotic, and yes, even traditional for that matter. To engage with this, we would have to start off on the foundational basis of traditional philosophy and compare it to the Marxist philosophy. In the case of traditional philosophy, it's often metaphysically grounded in philosophical idealism or Platonism. When we take Marx on face level, we have a philosophy that mixes idealism with materialism, therefore being incoherent. But this is not the place for that argument. See Momcilo's article here, or the video here. But when Vladimir Lenin came along later, relying much more off the mature Engels than the young Marx, he essentially detached Marx from his elements of idealism. For instance, in Lenin's 1909 book, Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, a book that would later be mandatory reading in higher education in the Soviet Union, he writes Marx's sense idealist side and says this, quote, "Materialism, in full agreement with natural science, takes matter as primary and regards consciousness, thought, sensation as secondary, because in its well-defined form, sensation is associated only with the higher forms of matter, that is, organic matter, while in the foundation of the structure of matter, one can only surmise the existence of a faculty akin to sensation," end quote. And, quote, "Sensation depends on the brain, nerves, retina, etc., i.e. on matter organized in a definite way. The existence of matter does not depend on sensation. Matter is primary. Sensation, thought, consciousness are the supreme product of matter organized in a particular way. Such are the views of materialism in general, and of Marx and Engels in particular," end quote. Violating Marx's opening line on the thesis on Feuerbach, Lenin sees sensation, thought, and even consciousness, apparently having solved the hard problem of consciousness, as simply matter organized in a particular way, even going as far as to say that this is the particular view of Marx himself. Meanwhile, Marx says that his philosophy is a correction of classical, i.e. vulgar materialism, which wrongly sees sensation as only in the form of the object or of contemplation, the exact way Lenin sees sensation as merely organized matter. So Lenin builds off dialectical materialism. In turn, he also extends it into materialist physicalism, that is to say, everything is reduced to simply being matter. Consciousness is matter, i.e. biology, religion is not real, Darwinian evolution theory, and Feuerbach, and everything is reduced to the plane of materiality. From here, we can properly understand the capital C communists, or Marxist-Leninists, as also following physicalism. Now, just from this point, you already have a complete departure from conservative or traditional philosophy. Traditionalist metaphysics is based on idealism, often some form of Platonism, which says that consciousness is separate from matter and often holds to an absolute prior consciousness, a god. Traditionalism completely rejects any form of materialism. This means all of creation, including matter, is dependent on prior consciousness. This is a fundamental contradiction between materialism and traditionalist philosophy that can never be reconciled with materialism. Building off of this point, we can look to the Communist Manifesto and can see what was the communist attitude to religions or other types of idealism. Quote, "All religions so far have been the expression of historical stages of development of individual peoples or groups of peoples, but communism is the stage of historical development which makes all existing religions superfluous and brings about their disappearance," end quote. We can see the logical extension of this in the actual policies of the Soviet Union, to which many of the conservative communists might counter by citing Stalin's opportunist revival of Christianity during World War II as a rallying cry to mobilize his nation, because men will not die for class. But after World War II, Christianity again became persecuted in the USSR. Even more hilarious is that when Stalin used the Orthodox Church, he basically mirrored Alfred Rosenberg's defunct heretical idea of the national church in Nazi Germany. Additionally, there is no actual evidence that Stalin ever seriously read or studied any traditional Russian or conservative texts. One of his intellectual biographers, Dr. Erich von Wrede, went through his massive personal library and came to this conclusion in the book The Political Thought of Joseph Stalin, quote, "Most of these thinkers can be put into the broad category of materialists, socialists, and forerunners of Marxism. Strikingly, the collection of books contained nothing written by Slavophiles, Pan-Slavists, or other Russian conservatives, other than literary figures and historians. For all his admiration of Ivan the Terrible and Peter the Great, Stalin seems to have been uninterested in the systems of thought that old Russia produced. The library reflected a serious lack of interest in traditions other than Marxism." End quote. The USSR, the first country to have on-demand abortions from its inception, advocated the destruction of all religions, and, to achieve this goal, it officially denounced all religious beliefs as superstitious and backwards. The USSR destroyed churches, synagogues, and mosques. They ridiculed, harassed, incarcerated, and executed religious leaders, flooded the schools and media with anti-religious teachings, and it introduced a belief system of state atheism. Lenin demanded that communist propaganda must employ militancy and irreconcilability towards all forms of idealism and religion. This was called militant atheism. Militant because it was an uncompromising attitude towards all religions. Militant atheism became central to the ideology of the Communist Party and a high-priority policy of all Soviet leaders. Soviet authorities forbade the criticism of atheism and agnosticism or of the state's anti-religious policies until 1936. Even during Stalin's tenure, the anti-religious attitudes increased, as the posters here demonstrate. The state also sought to control the activities of religious bodies and interfere in their internal affairs with the ultimate goal of making them disappear. To this effect, the state sought to control the activities of the leaders of different religious communities. Widespread violence by members of the Red Army against Christians was not openly supported by Lenin, but high-ranking Soviet officials like Yemelyan and Yaroslavsky claimed responsibility for these killings. It was documented that the Soviets cut up unarmed prisoners, scalped people and tortured believers, shot priests' wives and even children, and many other acts were even recorded in the documents of the Red Army. By 1930, 31 bishops, 1,600 clergy, and 7,000 monks were murdered by the Soviet Union. According to statistics available for 1930, they were then confined in prisons, under starvation conditions, 48 bishops, 3,700 clergy, and 8,000 monks and nuns. The International League against the Third Internationale at Geneva issued statistics on August 6 of 1935 showing that in Russia, 40,000 priests had been arrested, banished, or murdered. Also, you have the laws on separation of church and state in 1929. Under the 1929 laws, religious ministers could be charged from 5 to 10 times the rent that would be required from workers for the same property. In the USSR, there were various anti-religious campaigns that took place, the worst being Stalin's atheist 5-year plan. Churches were destroyed and many Christians like the Old Believers were subjected to genocide. Even in Maoist China, everything that was traditional about Chinese society was destroyed. So radical were the calls for iconoclasm that they even eventually turned on Mao and other senior leaders of the CCP because of apparent compromises. For a deeper look at this, simply watch the video titled Maoist China and Cultural Iconoclasm. I don't need to completely go in depth on this because it's been talked about before, but just starting from the surface level analysis, it's frankly ridiculous to claim that they were conservative or traditional. The communists held an atheistic materialistic worldview that was essentially modernist and anti-national in every way. Again, quoting the Communist Manifesto, quote, "In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past," end quote. Marxism, therefore, is revolutionary with regards to every facet of life and doesn't care about preserving anything. It is a philosophy of becoming and not a philosophy of being. This makes it one of the most modernist positions. So then, what does traditional or conservative philosophy say about modernism? If we look into one of the most well-known representatives of traditional philosophy, Julius Evola paints a picture of a constant spiritual regression and degeneration which is related to the highest spiritual elements of mankind, and not merely a superficial and materialistic one. Marxist historiography, borrowing from Enlightenment philosophy, preaches an unending linear view of progress from primitivism to slave societies to feudalism to capitalism and then to socialism, leading eventually to communism. This philosophy of progress is rooted entirely in a materialistic and bourgeois framework, largely building off of the Enlightenment ideas that predated Marx himself. Even the contemporary Marxist writer Chris Catrone admits as much, quote, "But such consciousness of history as the story of human freedom was not at all original to Marxism, but rather had its roots in the antecedent development of the self-conscious thought of emergent bourgeois society in the 18th century, beginning with Rousseau and elaborated by his followers Kant and Hegel. The radicalism of bourgeois thought consciousness of itself was an essential assumption of Marxism, which sought to carry forward the historical project of freedom. Rousseau wrote that while animals were machines wound up for functioning in a specific natural environment, humans could regard and reflect upon their own machinery and thus change it. This was Rousseau's radical notion of perfectibility, which was not in pursuit of an ideal of perfection, but rather open-ended in infinite adaptability. This was the new conception of freedom. Not freedom to be according to a fixed natural or divine form, but rather freedom to transform and realize new potential possibilities, to become new and different other than what we were before." End quote. We even see this, for instance, in the fact that Marx and Lenin praised the Jacobins, whom Haas somehow sees as the real patriots. Lenin stated, quote, "Bourgeois historians see Jacobinism as a fall, or to stoop. Proletarian historians see Jacobinism as one of the highest peaks in the emancipation struggle of an oppressed class. The Jacobins gave France the best models of a democratic revolution and of resistance to a coalition of monarchs against a republic. The Jacobins were not destined to win complete victory, however, chiefly because 18th century France was surrounded on the continent by much too backward countries, and because France herself lacked the material basis for socialism. There being no banks, no capitalist syndicates, no machine industry, and no railways. Jacobinism in Europe, or on the boundary line between Europe and Asia in the 20th century, would be the rule of the revolutionary class, of the proletariat, which, supported by the peasant poor and taking advantage of the existing material basis for advancing towards socialism, could not only provide all the great, ineradicable, unforgettable things provided by the Jacobins in the 18th century, but bring about a lasting worldwide victory for the working people." End quote. In summing up Marx's views on the French Revolution, J. Bergman writes, quote, "In short, Marx apothesized the French Revolution for the same reason Edmund Burke loathed it, because it was the result of human agency that caused an entire country, or at least a significant percentage of its inhabitants, to reject the accumulated experiences, traditions, and patterns of life that had existed for centuries." End quote. I would also recommend checking out a lecture by Professor Harry Oldmeadow called Tradition Betrayed. The idea of infinite progress lies at the core of Marxism. Some know monarchy, including the aristocrats that come with it, as the most traditional form of government. But in revolutionary France, the Legislative Assembly voted to abolish the monarchy and establish a republic. The measure came 1 year after King Louis XVI reluctantly approved a new constitution that stripped him of much of his power. The makeup of the old social organizations of feudalism were replaced for democratic structures, thus overturning all of the traditions, the most radical of these fanatics being the Jacobins. From this point, many representing the old traditional order were promptly executed by the revolutionaries in France. Lenin, who admired these revolutionary Jacobins, implemented many of the same measures they took against the monarchy. The Russian Empire had a revolution which toppled the entire institution of the monarchy and church, followed by a second revolution against the government in October of the same year that executed Tsar Nicholas and his family. Many aristocrats were killed or driven into exile. Many who stayed behind, the former people, as the Bolsheviks called them, perished in the purges or survived by concealing their origin. Similar measures were also taken up in Communist China, which is a testament to the iconoclastic elements of Marxist-Leninism. See, for example, the CCP's attempt under Mao to have the Emperor of China, Pu Yi, executed. This is the case because the existence of a monarchy implies the division of society into classes. Even if the monarch is a mere figurehead, as in the case of the last Emperor of China, the figurehead is a symbol of reaction, meaning that communism is inherently iconoclastic and revolutionary in the sense that it overturns old social traditional orders of the feudal system. Something else to add here is that, like in China, the Soviets, after establishing themselves as a functional government over Russia, proceeded to abolish the entire system, such as the laws, institutions, and even structures left over from the Russian Empire. This means there's no direct continuity at all with the Russian Empire to the USSR. This is yet another example of political iconoclasm within the Soviet Union. Friedrich Engels, in The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, puts forward the idea that the role of property is the creation of the traditional family and, as such, modern civilization. In essence, the family is a bourgeois construct according to Engels. So what is to happen to the family under communism? Looking at the Communist Manifesto, we see, quote, "Communism will transform the relations between the sexes into a purely private matter which concerns only the persons involved and into which society has no occasion to intervene. It can do this since it does away with private property and educates children on a communal basis, and in this way removes the two bases of traditional marriage, the dependence rooted in private property of the women on the man and of the children on the parents." End quote. This was seen, for instance, in studies of the modern Chinese family by Zheng Yi at Beijing University. He found that the shape and structure of families had changed radically under communist rule. This is something Caleb Maupin and the Infrared Collective would arguably deny, but the family size became much smaller. Fewer generations lived in the same household, and the divorce rate rose. Zheng Yi attributes this to the policies of the Cultural Revolution and the Maoist iconoclasm that took part in China, which assaulted the age-old tradition of family piety and Confucian family structures. In the Soviet Union, the goal was to gradually phase out the family as well. Alexander Goikbarg, one of the leading legal jurists, considered the family unit to be a necessary but transitive social arrangement that would quickly be phased out by the growing communal resources of the state and would eventually wither away. The jurists intended to maintain protections for women and children until a system of total communal support could be established, which would totally abolish the traditional family. The 1936 legal code headed by Stalin emerged along with an eruption of pro-family propaganda. This included restrictions on abortions and imposed fines and jail time for any that received or performed the service. The code also enacted a bevy of laws aimed to encourage pregnancy and childbirth. Insurance stipends, pregnancy leave, job security, light duty, childcare services, and payments for large families. In another drastic move, the code made it more difficult to obtain a divorce. Under the code, both parties would need to be present for a divorce and pay a fine. There could be harsh penalties for those who failed to pay alimony and child support payments. The wider campaign to encourage the family unit elevated motherhood to a form of Stachovite labor. During this time, motherhood was celebrated as patriotic, and the joys of children and family were extolled by the country's leaders. These reforms could be interpreted as a form of conservatism, but this is actually not the case. In the early 1920s, with the weakening of the family, combined with the devastation and dislocation caused by the Russian Civil War, senior Bolshevik party officials were prompted to conclude that the state needed a more stable family life to rebuild the country's economy and shattered social structure. After Stalin's death in 1953, the government rescinded some of its natalist legislation. In 1955, it declared abortions for medical reasons legal, and in 1968, it yet again declared all abortions legal. The state also liberalized divorce procedures in the mid-1960s. Maoist China would similarly follow a path like this. So, to the extent that communist countries were conservative, it is when they went against Marxist theory only insofar because the political reality demanded that they do so in order to maintain their social order. Which again brings us back to the topic of opportunism. Whenever the opportunity arose, these communist countries again would assault traditionalism only when it would not disrupt stability. These countries were not as conservative as some think, but instead were much more reactionary in the sense they reacted to every problem they faced on a utilitarian level. Whenever they could, they would accelerate the logic of capital and attack traditional institutions, as Marxist theory dictates. But when faced with reality, they would rein some of its excesses when, for instance, they needed to win a world war. For at the end of the day, "for the motherland" is a much more invigorating battle cry than "for dialectical materialism." Oswald Spengler, one of the seminal traditionalist philosopher historians, was intrinsically anti-capitalist. He and others saw in capitalism and the rise of the bourgeoisie the agency of destruction of the foundations of traditional orders, as did Marx. The essential difference, however, is that the Marxists regarded it as part of a historical progression, whereas the traditionalists, like Spengler, regarded it as a symptom of decline. Western civilization prides itself on being the epitome of progress through its economic activity. It is based on the illusion of linear evolution. Perhaps few words have more succinctly expressed the antithesis between the modernist and the traditional conservative perceptions of life than the ebullient optimism of the 19th century biologist Dr. A.R. Wallace in The Wonderful Century. Quote, "Not only is our century superior to any that have gone before it, but it may be best compared with the whole preceding historical period. It must therefore be held to constitute the beginning of a new era of human progress. We men of the 19th century have not been slow to praise it. The wise and the foolish, the learned and the unlearned, the poet and the pressman, the rich and the poor, alike swell the chorus of admiration for the marvelous inventions and discoveries of our own age, and especially for those innumerable applications of science which now form part of our daily life, and which remind us every hour of our immense superiority over our comparatively ignorant forefathers." End quote. Like Marx's belief that communism is the last mode of human life, capitalism has the same belief. In both worldviews, there is nothing other than further progress of a technical nature. Both doctrines represent the end of history. The traditionalist, however, views history not as a straight line from primitive to modern, but as one of continual ebb and flow, ocean tides, or cycles. As Alexander Dugin put it, quote, "Instead of growth, progress, and development, there is life. After all, there has been no proof offered yet to show that life is linked to growth. This was the myth of the 19th century. There is no life without death. Being towards death is not a struggle with life, but rather its glorification and its foundation." End quote. While Marx's wheel of history moves forward, trampling over all tradition and heritage until it stops forever at a gray, flat wall of concrete and steel, the traditionalist wheel of history revolves in a cycle on a stable axis. Spengler writes of the latter era, quote, "And now the economic tendency became uppermost in the stealthy form of revolution typical of the century, which is called democracy, and demonstrates itself periodically in revolts by ballot or barricaded on the part of the masses. In England, the free trade doctrine of the Manchester School was applied by the trades unions to the form of goods called labor, and eventually received theoretical formulation in the Communist Manifesto of Marx and Engels. And so was completed the dethronement of politics by economics, of the state by the counting house." End quote. Spengler calls Marxian types of socialism capitalistic because they do not aim to replace money-based values, but to possess them. See for instance how Marx speaks of free trade. Quote, "Generally speaking, the protectionist system today is conservative, whereas the free trade system has a destructive effect. It destroys the former nationalities and renders the contrast between proletariat and bourgeois more acute. In a word, the free trade system is precipitating the social revolution, and only in this revolutionary sense do I vote for free trade." End quote. For Marx, capitalism was part of an inexorable dialectical process that, like the progressive linear view of history, sees humanity ascending from primitive communism, slave societies throughout feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and ultimately, as the end of history, to a millennial world of communism. Throughout this dialectical progressive unfolding, the impelling force of history is class struggle for the primacy of sectional economic interests. In Marxian economic reductionism, history is relegated to the struggle, quote, between free man and slave, practitioner and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, in constant opposition to one another, carried on uninterrupted, now hidden, now open, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes, end quote. Marx accurately describes the destruction of traditional society as intrinsic to capitalism, and goes on to describe what we today call globalization. Those who advocate for free trade while calling themselves conservatives might like to consider why Marx supported free trade and described it as both destructive and as revolutionary. Marx saw it as the necessary ingredient of the dialectical process that is imposing universal standardization. This is likewise precisely the aim of communism. Elaborating on the dialectical role of capitalism, Marx states whenever the bourgeoisie, quote, has got the upper hand and has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations, end quote, the bourgeoisie, or what we might call the merchant class, which is accorded a subordinate position in the traditional societies, but assumes superiority under communism, quote, has pitilessly torn asunder feudal bonds, end quote, and, quote, has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, end quote, and, quote, callous cash payment, end quote. It has, amongst other things, quote, drowned religiosity and chivalry in the icy water of egotistical calculation, end quote. End quote. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single, unconscionable freedom, free trade, end quote. The conservative doesn't per se oppose Marx's view of how capitalism functions. The conservative must oppose Marx's high appraisal for this system as both inexorable and desirable. Marx condemned opposition to this dialectical process as revolutionary. He saw the constant need for the revolutionizing of the instruments of production as inevitable under capitalism, and this, in turn, brought society into a continual state of flux, of, quote, everlasting uncertainty and agitation, end quote, which distinguishes the, quote, bourgeoisie epoch from all other ones, end quote. The need for a constantly expanding market means that capitalism spreads globally and thereby gives cosmopolitan character to modes of production and consumption in every country. In Marxist dialectics, this is a necessary part of destroying national boundaries and distinctive cultures as a prelude to world socialism. It is capitalism that establishes the basis of internationalism. Marx writes of the manner by which the rural basis of the traditional order succumbs to urbanization and industrialization, which is what formed the proletariat, the rootless mass that is upheld by socialism as the ideal rather than as a corrupt aberration. Traditional societies are literally rooted in blood and soil. Under capitalism, village life and localized life are, as Marx said, made passé by the city and mass production. Marx referred to the country being subjected to the rule of the towns. It was a phenomenon, the rise of the city concomitant with the rise of the merchant. Traditionalists like René Guignon see this as a symptom of the decay of civilization in its sterile phase, where money value rules. Marx writes that what has been created is enormous cities, what Spengler calls megalopolitanism. Again, what distinguishes Marx from the traditionalists in his analysis of capitalism is that he welcomes this destructive feature of capitalism. When Marx writes of urbanization and the alienation of the former peasantry and artisans by their proletarianization in the cities, thereby becoming cogs in the mass production process, he refers to this not as a process to be resisted, but as inexorable and as having, quote, rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life, end quote. The peasantry is therefore condemned to the proletarian disposition until it recognizes its historical revolutionary class role and, quote, expropriates the expropriators, end quote. This peasant class can either emerge from purgatory by joining the ranks of the proletarian chosen people, become part of the socialist revolution and enter a new millennium, or it can descend from its class purgatory if it insists on trying to maintain the traditional order, and be co-signed to oblivion, which is why the Bolsheviks massacred peasants or forced them into the cities. This also applies to the middle class. Marx points out in the Communist Manifesto that reactionaries view with great chagrin the dialectical process of capitalism. The reactionary, or the traditionalist conservative, is the anti-capitalist par excellence because he is above and beyond the zeitgeist from which both capitalism and Marxism emerged, and he rejects in total the economic reductionism on which both are founded upon. Both the conservatives and Marxists recognize the destructive and revolutionary nature of capitalism. For the conservatives, this is a detriment, but for the Marxists, this is a good thing, since it makes a more global world which can serve as a substrate to facilitate communism. It leads to progress, and for this very reason, Marx and his acolytes view his ideas as completing the project of the bourgeois liberal society. Capitalism, for Marx and Marxists, is merely a betrayal of the bourgeois promise of freedom which it seeks to enact. A more detailed critique on the failure of communism to critique capitalism by Momcilo can be found here. As Rudolf Jung reminds us, quote, socialism and materialism are, after all, simply incompatible, because the former is the highest altruism, while the latter is the most flagrant egoism. And so, socialism built upon materialism, again, ends only in individualism, end quote. Marx devotes section 3 of his Communist Manifesto to a repudiation of reactionary socialism. He condemns the feudal socialism that arose among the old remnants of the aristocracy, which had sought to join forces with the working class against the bourgeoisie. Marx states that the aristocracy, in trying to assert their pre-bourgeois position, had actually lost sight of their own class interests in siding with the proletariat. An alliance of the dispossessed professions into what had become the so-called proletariat with the increasingly dispossessed aristocracy is an organic alliance which finds its enemies as much in Marxism as it does in capitalism. Marx raged against the budding alliance between the aristocracy and those dispossessed professions that resisted being proletarianized. Hence, Marx condemns feudal socialism as, quote, half echo of the past, half menace of the future, end quote. It was a movement that enjoyed significant support among craftsmen, clergymen, nobles, and literaries in Germany in 1848, who repudiated the free market that had divorced man from church, state, and community, and, quote, placed egoism and self-interest before subordination, commonality, and social solidarity, end quote. Max Baer, a historian of German socialism, stated of these reactionaries, as Marx called them, quote, the modern era seemed to them to be built on quicksand, to be chaos, anarchy, or an utter, unmoral, and godless outburst of intellectual and economic forces, which must inevitably lead to acute social antagonism, to extremes of wealth and poverty, and to a universal upheaval. In this frame of mind, the Middle Ages, with its firm order in church, economic, and social life, its faith in God, its feudal tenures, its cloisters, its autonomous associations, and its guilds appeared to these thinkers like a well-compacted building, end quote. It is just such an alliance of all classes, once vehemently condemned by Marx as reactionary, that is required to resist the common subversive phenomena of free trade and revolution. If the conservative wishes to restore the health of the cultural organism that is predicated on traditional values, then they cannot do so by embracing economic doctrines that are themselves antithetical to tradition, and which were welcomed by Marx as part of a subversive process to destroy tradition. In fact, this is what Lenin says regarding this matter, quote, Although the alliance which has come into being in the Balkans is an alliance of monarchies and not of republics, and although this alliance has come about through war and not through revolution, a great step has nevertheless been taken towards doing away with the survivals of medievalism throughout Eastern Europe. And you are rejoicing prematurely, nationalist gentlemen. That step is against you, for there are more survivors of medievalism in Russia than anywhere else." End quote. Organizationally, the traditionalists used guilds or corporations which were seen as manifestations of the divine order, which, with the destruction of the traditionalist societies, they were replaced by trade unions and professional associations that aim only to secure the economic benefits of members against other trades and professions, and which seek to negate the duty and responsibility one had in being a proud member of one's craft, where a code of honor was in force. Julius Evola stated, like the corporations of classical Rome, the medieval guilds were predicated on religion and ethics, not on economics. Julius Evola states, quote, "The Marxian antithesis between capital and labor, between employers and employees, at the time would have been inconceivable." End quote. The Italian fascist Alfredo Rocco stated this about the guilds, quote, "The corporations, that would be the guilds, which were overthrown by the individualism of the natural rights philosophy and the egalitarianism of the French Revolution, may well live again in the social ideals of Italian nationalism. In the corporations, we have not an absurd equality, but discipline and differences. The corporations all participate in production, being associated in a genuine and fruitful fraternity of the classes." End quote. It was precisely this convergence of traditionalist ideas within fascism that would motivate traditionalists like Evola to become collaborators within the Axis powers. Evola, like many other traditionalists, saw an opportunity to use fascism to revive traditionalism. Regardless of the modernist or more nominalistic aspects within fascism, it included an organic conception of the development of nations and ethnic identity within spirit, provided by the guild model. This, however, never occurred with Marxism, as fascism's understanding of Hegelian dialectics overlapped with the traditionalist school's understanding of monism. Marx himself repudiated Hegel's dialectics, whose concept of the idea seemed of a religious character to Marx, who countered this metaphysical idea with the material world. Hegel, on the other hand, wrote about how the historical dialectic worked on the national spirit, his philosophy being a part of the rightist doctrinal stream that was receiving an important impetus from the German thinkers in antithesis to English thought based on economics, which imbued Marxist thinking and hence mirrored capitalism. Hegel wrote, for example, quote, "The result of this process is then that spirit, in rendering itself objective and making this its being an object of thought, on the one hand destroys the determinate form of its being, and on the other hand gains a comprehension of the universal element which it involves, and thereby gives a new form to its inherent principle. In virtue of this, the substantial character of the national spirit has been altered. That is, its principle has risen into another, and in fact a higher principle. It is of the highest importance in apprehending and comprehending history to have and to understand the thought involved in this transition. The individual traverses as a unity various grades of development and remains the same individual. In like manner also does a people, till the spirit, which it embodies, reaches the grade of universality. In this point lies the fundamental, the ideal necessity of transition. This is the soul, the essential consideration of the philosophical comprehension of history." End quote. This national spirit, according to both Marx and Engels, was an epiphenomenon of bourgeois society, and they denied any ontological priority or any other metaphysical rootedness to nationalism. This was taken up by other Marxists like the Jewish historian Erich Hobsbawm, who argued that national identity is an outgrowth of bourgeois society. Quote, "Nations exist not only as functions of a particular kind of territorial state, or the aspiration to establish one, but also in the extent of a particular stage of technological and economic development." End quote. Something which flies in the face of Haas and the Infrared's collective's assertion that, quote, The objectivity of the nation, including its rights, rituals, and the national spirit defining a people, is something which communists should strive to authentically express rather than ignore. The realities of the nation cannot be wished away." End quote. Contrary to what Haas and his associates state, Marxism has always emphasized that the global workers' movement is greater than national interest, and dispute the notion that the realities of the nation cannot be wished away, for this is exactly the Marxist assertion. For instance, Marx and Engels wrote that, quote, "The nationalities of the peoples associating themselves in accordance with the principle of community will be compelled to mingle with each other as a result of this association and thereby to dissolve themselves, just as the various estate and class distinctions must disappear through the abolition of their basis, private property." End quote. We see this continued by Lenin, quote, "The party of the proletariat emphatically rejects what is known as national cultural autonomy, under which education, etc., is removed from the control of the state and put in the control of some kind of national diets. National cultural autonomy artificially divides the workers living in one locality, and even working in the same industrial enterprise according to their various national cultures. In other words, it strengthens the ties between the workers and the bourgeois culture of their nations, whereas the aim of the Social Democrats is to develop the international culture of the world proletariat." End quote. Quote, "It is our duty to teach the workers to be indifferent to national distinctions. There is no doubt about that. But it must not be the indifference of the annexationists. A member of an oppressor nation must be indifferent to whether small nations belong to his state or to a neighboring state, or to themselves according to where their sympathies lie. Without such a difference, he is not a social democrat. To be an internationalist social democrat, one must not think only of one's own nation, but place above it the interests of all nations, their common liberty and equality." End quote. Quote, "Petty bourgeois nationalism proclaims as internationalism the mere recognition of the equality of nations and nothing more. Quite apart from the fact that this recognition is purely verbal, petty bourgeois nationalism preserves national self-interest intact, whereas proletarian internationalism demands, first, that the interests of the proletarian struggle in any one country should be subordinated to the interests of that struggle on a worldwide scale, and, second, that a nation which is achieving victory over the bourgeoisie should be able and willing to make the greatest national sacrifices for the overthrow of international capital." End quote. Quote, "One such idea is refined nationalism, which advocates the division and splitting up of the proletariat on the most plausible and specious pretexts, as for example, that of protecting the interests of national culture, national autonomy, or independence, and so on and so forth. The class-conscious workers fight hard against every kind of nationalism, both the crude, violent, black hundred nationalism, and the most refined nationalism which preaches the equality of nations together with the splitting up of the workers' cause, the workers' organizations, and the working class movement according to nationality. Unlike all the varieties of the nationalist bourgeoisie, the class-conscious workers carrying out the decisions of the recent summer 1913 conference of the Marxists stand not only for the most complete, consistent, and fully applied equality of nations and languages, but also for the amalgamation of the workers of the different nationalities in united proletarian organizations of every kind." End quote. For a traditional understanding of nations, I would recommend this video by Keith Woods called The Origins of Nations. So obviously Haas contradicts Marx and Lenin here when he states, quote, "The objectivity of the nation, including its rights, rituals, and the national spirit defining a people is something which communists should strive to authentically express rather than ignore. The realities of the nation cannot be wished away." End quote. Then, what exactly was the traditionalist understanding of the nation that was in conflict with Marxism? Well, we can look towards Nikolai Yakovlevich Danilevsky, a Russian philosopher. Danilevsky distinguished 5 categories of historical cultural activity. Number 1, religious. Number 2, political. Number 3, psychological. Number 4, cultural. And number 5, biological. For this he used biological and morphological metaphors in the comparisons of cultures. Danielewski compared cultures and nations to biological species, denied their commonality, and argued that each nation or civilization is united by its language and culture, which it cannot pass on to any other nation. He stood in opposition to Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and for a theory of historical cultural types. Lev Nikolaevich Gumilyov, another Russian historian, builds off of Danielewski to describe the genesis and evolution of ethnic groups and, therefore, the creation of nations. This was seen as passing through the stages of birth, development, climax, inertia, convolution, and memorial. This would create nations through ethnogenesis. Ivan Ilyin, another Russian traditionalist philosopher, would in turn continue this hypothesis, extending it into a spiritual conception of nations. Quote, "And that is why the motherland is, for us, not an object of everyday addiction, but a genuine religious shrine. While fighting for the motherland, we are fighting for the perfection and strength and freedom of the Russian spirit. And for its flourishing, we need both territory and state power. And therefore, our domestic motto has always been, for us, not religious, but religious meaning. All for the motherland. All for the motherland." End quote. Another traditionalist on this, Charles Maurras, states, quote, "We are our ancestors, our masters, our elders. We are our books, our paintings, our statues, our landscapes." End quote. This would obviously show direct contradiction to the insanity promoted by the atheistic and materialistic analysis of the communist aspirations of an internationalized, borderless world with no national identity, furthering our point that the traditionalist and conservative understandings of the world are not compatible with the modernist ideas of communism. Just from this alone, the conclusion is quite clear. Communists are not conservatives, Haas, especially if your ideas are built upon democratic ideals. Quote, "Aristocracy, taken in its etymological sense, means precisely the power of the elite. The elite can, by definition, only be the few, and their power, or rather their authority, deriving as it does from their intellectual superiority, has nothing in common with the numerical strength on which democracy is based, a strength whose inherent tendency is to sacrifice the minority to the majority, and therefore quality to quantity, and the elite to the masses." End quote. To properly understand traditionalism, we must take Fritjof Schuon as our example, as he is the best representative of traditionalism. For Schuon, modernity is characterized by rationalism, which denies the possibility of a supra-rational knowledge, materialism, according to which only matter gives meaning to life, psychologism, which reduces the spiritual and the intellectual to the psychic, skepticism, relativism, existentialism, individualism, progressivism, evolutionism, scientism, and empiricism, without forgetting agnosticism and atheism, all of which can be found inside of Marxism as a philosophy. Regarding modern science, in spite of the scale of its discoveries on the physical plane, Schuon reproaches it for being, quote, "a totalitarian rationalism which eliminates both revelation and intellect, and at the same time a totalitarian materialism which ignores the metaphysical relativity of matter and the world. It does not know that the suprasensible, which is beyond space and time, is the concrete principle of the world, and that it is consequently also at the origin of that contingent and changeable coagulation called matter." End quote. Thus, still, according to Schuon, the contradiction of scientism is to, quote, "want to give an account of reality without the help of this initial science that is metaphysics, thus ignoring that only the science of the absolute gives meaning and discipline to the science of the relative." End quote. This conception of a universe which ignores as much the principle of creative emanationism as it does that of the hierarchy of the invisible worlds has engendered that most typical offspring of the modern spirit, the theory of evolution, with its corollary, the illusion of human progress. But to get the full traditionalist context on nations, I think Alexander Dugin can help us, a figure whom Haas poorly understands. And, of course, he has even claimed in his writings that Dugin's fourth political theory is materialistic and Maoist. As when Haas rhetorically asks, quote, What if this fourth political theory is none other than Marxism-Leninism itself? End quote. Insinuating that Dugin's fourth political theory is secretly Marxist-Leninist, since, quote, not only the adoption of a fourth, but a fifth, sixth, seventh, etc. political theory are already integral to the constantly self-revolutionizing, self-reforming, and self-reconstructing nature of Chinese communism, or Maoism, end quote. While it is no secret, I have written that I believe that Dugin's fourth political theory is basically a form of Russian third positionism, or at least more than he lets on. This is reasonable given that Dugin himself has written in Eurasian Mission that this neo-Eurasianism is, quote, akin to traditionalism or the third position, end quote, and that, quote, from the European third way to the fourth political theory is only one step, end quote. This would also explain his connections to Nazi Maoist Franco Freda and former Waffen-SS member Jean-François Diriart. Moreover, Dugin's basis for his geopolitics is twofold in Heidegger's Dasein and Carl Schmitt's concept of large spaces. Ignoring the question of Heidegger's affinity with German third positionism, Schmitt's idea of large spaces, as Brendan Sims, Hitler's preeminent intellectual biographer, writes, stems from Hitler himself. Quote, Hitler's idea of a German Monroe Doctrine, which he had first mentioned more than a decade earlier in 1923, was picked up by the lawyer Carl Schmitt, who elaborated it into an entire theory of large spaces, end quote. So one of two main prongs of Dugin's geopolitical philosophy comes from the mind of Adolf Hitler himself, with the other prong having a complicated, at best, relationship with the Third Reich. In 2015, a Maoist blogger interviewed Dugin, and it was even syndicated on one of his websites, and when he was asked about Mao and Maoism, he said, quote, Mao was right in affirming that socialism should not exclusively be proletarian, but also peasant and based on the ethnic traditions. It is closer to the truth than universalist, industrial, internationalist versions represented by Trotskyism. But I think that sacred part in Maoism was missed or underdeveloped. Its links with Confucianism and Taoism were weak. Maoism is too modern for me. For China, it would be the best solution to preserve the socialism and political domination of national communist parties as today, but develop more sacred tradition, such as Confucianism and Taoism. It is rather significant that the ideas of Heidegger are attentively explored now by hundreds of Chinese scientists. I think fourth political theory could fit to contemporary China best of all, end quote. In the same interview, Dugin is also quick to make it clear that, quote, it's not communist nor Marxist because I refuse the materialism of any kind and deny the progress. It is so much more correct to describe my views as fourth political theory and traditionalism, end quote. Haas further betrays a proper understanding of Dugin when he projects a vulgar materialistic metaphysics into Dugin. Haas states, quote, as a discipline of Heidegger, Dugin was able to recognize the material and objective reality of Russian civilization and geopolitics beyond ideology, end quote. As well as, quote, Dugin's writings confine themselves to their real material premises, i.e., in the form of geopolitics, the unconscious realities of Russian civilization, etc., end quote. And finally, quote, Dugin, following Heidegger, recognizes the fundamental and latent ambiguity of material being, end quote. Haas refuses to acknowledge the obvious. Dugin is not a materialist. This is honestly ridiculous, and I have to explain this. Here is Alexander Dugin stating it explicitly in an interview with one of his English translators. Quote, in order to get to such an understanding of the mystical dimension of the thought, we need to sacrifice materialism. We should recognize this kind of alternative sovereignty of the thought, of the spirit, of the subject, and that is very important. But for me, not being a materialist, that is quite easy, end quote. Dugin isn't about recognizing the material and objective reality of Russian civilization. As a follower of Heidegger, and to an extent Husserl, he has, which is clear from a cursory reading of the fourth political theory, a very phenomenological approach as compared to a materialist approach. Dugin very explicitly rejects any form of materialism, whether it be vulgar or dialectical, for a more immaterial, phenomenological, mystical, and idealist approach to philosophy. As he writes in Putin vs. Putin, quote, The fourth political theory can be attributed to the fields of phenomenology, structuralism, existentialism, ethnosociology, and cultural anthropology." End quote. So whether or not there is an actual material basis of the Russian folk, or narod, is irrelevant, for, as is laid out in the ethnosociological theory, which can be found most explicitly in his book Ethnos and Society, it is not about shared genes that define a people, but a recognition of common origin, along with shared language and traditions. It is not about finding some material basis to ground a people in. Dugin and the fourth political theory doesn't see nations as an objective reality. In Volume 2 of the fourth political theory, in the last appendix, he makes it clear that the nation is a subjective reality, and contrasts it to the third political theory, which he claims sees the nation as an objective reality. Moreover, this phenomenological and ethno-sociological approach should make it clear that he isn't concerned with a material reality of some group of people. Dugin even attacks Vladimir Putin for being too concerned with the material reality of Russians and the Eurasian civilization, stating, quote, "In my opinion, even Putin's approach to problems is purely corporeal. Much like Epicurus, he sees the population as an aggregate of material objects that one must feed. This is all materialism. Putin suggests uniting the post-Soviet landscape in the same way, on a materialistic basis. I think that it's necessary to move on to the politics of spirit." End quote. And a simple read from Dugin's book, A Theory of a Multipolar World, disproves that he is approaching multipolarity from any sort of materialistic perspective. Quote, "This leads to the most logical conclusion. The economic model of the multipolar world must be based on the rejection of economic centrism and the reduction of economic factors to a lower level than social, cultural, religious, and political factors. Without the relativization of the economy, without the subordination of the material to the spiritual, without the transformation of the economic sphere into a subordinate and secondary one, in relation to the dimension of civilization in general, multipolarism is impossible." End quote. Moreover, his book lays out that his geopolitics is based on idealism plus holism, and rejects the material plus holism of Marxism, the materialism plus individualism of realism, and the idealism plus individualism of liberalism, saying, quote, "Idealism highlights the decisive importance given to concepts, theories, ideas, points of views, texts, when compared to matter, the empirical field, considered as secondary and derivative. Holism, in turn, calls attention to the fact that we are talking about a whole system, before the allocation of its individual atomic actors, not being possible for them to exist on their own." End quote. Going further, Dugin's civilizational and geopolitical theory is ontologically based on Carl Jung's collective unconsciousness and the monad from arch-anti-materialist Leibniz, a topic talked about by Momcilo Nevesky in his video on Alexander Dugin, The Theory of a Multipolar World, which Dugin himself syndicated. And for Dugin, the narod, or das Volk, is not, as Haas claims, Dugin says, quote, "material and objective reality," end quote, but rather, as Dugin himself actually explains, quote, "what we call the body of the narod, or the Wirtschaft, that is the economy, and production causes, in this case, to be a separate domain, defined by the material factor. Henceforth, it is the domain of care, but that just is Dasein, which cannot but be concerned," end quote. Of all the takes on Dugin, the idea that Dugin is actually a materialist and is actually talking about Marxist-Leninist Maoism is the most absurd position, especially given that Dugin has time and time again in his writings and speeches very explicitly rejected Marxism and all forms of materialism. The idea that a devout Orthodox Christian who is heavily steeped in his tradition is, as Haas puts it, quote, "too materialistic, that is vaguely and one-sidedly materialistic and not dialectical," end quote, is very insulting to his intelligence and betrays the fact that Haas has no idea what he is talking about when it comes to Dugin's philosophy. Dugin also essentially takes the same critique that Momcilo made in this video, attacking Haas, and the patriotic socialists, which made him so mad that in watching it, he literally punches his camera like a child. For instance, Dugin doesn't see the historically self-called Marxist regimes to really be Marxist at all. Rather, they are forms of what he calls national communism, of which, he writes in the fourth political theory, quote, reckon themselves as being simply communists and orthodox Marxists, strictly following the teachings of the communist classics, end quote. In seeing how these regimes took certain nationalistic, patriotic, and various traditionalist tappings, however superficial, he notes in volume 2 of the fourth political theory, quote, in communist regimes, Marxism was not what it was claimed to be, but was, rather, a model of exogenous modernization in which Western values were adopted only partially and were tacitly combined with local religious, eschatological, and messianic tendencies. On the whole, this procedure of specific modernization, alter-modernization along the socialistic or totalitarian, but not capitalistic or democratic path, served for the defense of the geopolitical and strategic interests of independent states, which were striving to repel the colonial attacks of Europe and later America, end quote. In regards to Joseph Stalin, Dugin notes in Last War of the World Island that as late as May 1924, Stalin took the orthodox Marxist, sometimes derogatorily called Trotskyism by tankies, line of denying the possibility of socialism in one country, and only by the end of 1924 did he break with orthodox Marxism and start the project, although rather implicitly, of national communism. Marxism is the epitome of bourgeois ideology, and Marxism is looking backwards into history to project forwards into the future a bourgeois-centric worldview, tied up with notions of class, progress, etc. In short, Marxism conceives of communism as a higher form of bourgeois society, as pointed out in The Worker by the German conservative Ernst Jünger. We can only conclude from this that those who push the idea of conservative communism, such as Haas, are trying to fool the dissident right for a communist revolution. This is an opportunistic pragmatism, and this is the real threat of Haas and his ridiculous project. The Marxist critique of Haas pushing things into the right-wing direction is obviously wrong. This is more of a means to siphon off support from the right, which is basically to castrate any right-wing or nationalistic alternatives. Some communists look at him thinking he's a secret fascist, and I fell for this in our debate, when I appealed to a red-brown one-struggle idea, but this is not his goal. His political Satanism is a means to an end, a bourgeois worldview, a red specter of terror. Haas is the left-wing version of the right-wing lolcow grifter Nick Fuentes for this very reason. Here are some final words by Father Seraphim Rose, quote, the beginning of religious awakening in Russia is invariably accompanied by a loss of trust and faith in communism. Communism, not first of all as a political and economic system, but as a faith. This is natural because the first article of communist faith is atheism, the state religion of the USSR, which makes sense only as a substitute for faith in God. Belief in God naturally is bound up with the disbelief in atheism and communism, and that is why the religious awakening in Russia today is not merely something personal, but takes on the character of a national movement, end quote. And here's another final quote by a traditionalist who influenced Dugin and was a true Khan of the Mongolians, unlike Haas. Quote, I do not care about doctrines. Bolshevism is what others in Europe call Americanism. Commissar and merchants are the same, end quote. The following commentary does not come from the script used for this video, but are my own personal thoughts on Karl Marx and Marxism in general. As some of you already know, I am a vehement anti-liberal who rejects humanism, but most specifically liberal humanism as a philosophy both on theological and ontological grounds. For this reason, I reject the entire spectrum of liberalism, even up to the classical liberalism of Hobbes and Locke. That being the case, I will now share my own personal thoughts on Karl Marx. You may have seen the usage of the imagery of the figures John Locke, Adam Smith, Maximilien de Robespierre, and Oliver Cromwell surrounding Karl Marx in the video Abandoning Liberal Myths. The reason for this is quite clear, and I shall briefly expound upon this idea further herewith. Where was it that British political economy drew its epistemic perspective from? Where was it that the French and the Germans got their humanistic love of liberty from? It all started in the British Isles as a reaction both to Catholic Aristotelianism and French rationalism. The history of ideas is far more complex than many make it out to be. So what do you get when you take Hobbes and Locke, combine their ideas, and take them to their logical conclusions about what they think the superlative good, i.e. production, liberty, and peace at all cost, is? You get Karl Marx. Although he was not an Englishman himself, Karl Marx epitomizes the teleological development of Anglo-liberal humanist thought. Karl Marx was a man who spent most of his life writing in London and building upon Anglo-political economic theories that are steeped in empirical and nominalist epistemological views that have been so typical for liberal English thinkers for several centuries now. Karl Marx, the sociologist, simply built upon Karl Marx the philosopher, and it was Karl Marx the philosopher who was obsessed with liberal humanist constructs such as emancipation and liberation. Perhaps the main difference between Hobbes/Locke and Marx is that Hobbes argues that the science of man is still somehow different from the science of natural things. Locke argues that private property could be potentially justified if handled responsibly. Marx goes further than both Hobbes and Locke in that he says that man is a part of nature and can be studied scientifically like everything else. He claims that private property is never justified after its role in history is fulfilled, and that true liberty is found only at the end of history. In short, Marx's critique of classical liberalism is only that it doesn't go far enough. What this means is rather quite remarkable. Karl Marx was actually a hyper-liberal humanist. He thought that the liberal humanists of the past didn't go far enough. Within Marx's eschatology, liberalism, which gave us economic capitalism, is an absolutely necessary step to achieve the communist ideal. This spits in the faces of virtually all traditionalist thinkers who were very clear in their lamentations of this phenomena as a manifestation of decline. That is to say, something to be wholly rejected and opposed, and certainly not embraced as a necessary step for a greater overreaching humanist project. The conclusion for me is quite clear. Karl Marx was an anti-liberal only in the sense that he was another liberal, as in another kind of liberal. I would describe Karl Marx as a super-liberal, and consequently deem communism as everything but conservative. In fact, I would go as far as to describe communism as nothing more than liberalism in decay.
In order to understand my views on state, or fourth political theory on state, we need to put it on the historic line. So, the modern state, bourgeois state, was introduced in order to destroy medieval, Middle Age version of the politics. So that it was based on the religion and on the empire. Religion, Catholic religion, and empire, Western Empire, were two main principles of legitimacy of the political order. But introduction of the modern state with individual identity as a citizen was a kind of modernity destroying tradition, Western tradition. And liberalism in this stage was the defense of the national statehood against the power of the Pope and the empire. So liberalism and the beginning of the modern era was represented by nationalism. So nationalism was liberal and bourgeois, and liberalism was national. So nationalism was liberal and bourgeois, and liberalism was national. But after destroying completely this Middle Age political order, the Europe of nations was born. And that was a kind of creation of new artificial identity, national identity. New artificial identity, national identity. Completely artificial. That wasn't continuation of the ancient tribes of people, of ethnic groups. It was the myth created by bourgeois in order to unite something that's completely atomized, completely dispersed. In order to create that, that was a concept of nation imagined. So I agree with Gellner or Anderson, Benedict Anderson, concerning imagined community. So nation wasn't organic. Nation was creation of bourgeois. And liberal was little by little destroying traditional political order and using national state in order to impose individual identity. They have accomplished step by step to the end of the 20th century. They have fulfilled this mission. So national statehood is no more needed for liberals. Now liberals are making the shift from national statehood towards global society, one world order, new world order, and so on, world government, because national states already fulfilled their destructive modernizing mission. National states already fulfilled their destructive modernizing mission. So new generation of liberals is against national state, not by principles as myself, because I am against that, because that has destroyed traditional political order that I defend and I recognize as something positive. But liberals have completely different agenda. They have used national states, they have destroyed traditional order, and now they begin to overcome and to create global society without national statehood. I think that the problem is not in the last stage of this transition from the national state towards global society, but in the earlier stage, when we have accepted national statehood, we already have said no to the traditional order.
I am rejecting liberalism, but because liberalism is the universal dogma, so I am challenging what everybody thinks, or the kind of ideological ground of contemporary world. So that is really dangerous. But the most important in all that, why it is really dangerous, because I am against all forms of anti-liberalism that belong to the past. And first of all, I am anti-communist and anti-fascist, because these two forms of anti-liberalism belong to the past, and I'm trying to attack liberalism from the future or from the present, and I'm calling that third totalitarianism. First was communist, second fascist, and now when we have done with first and second totalitarianism, we are dealing. Welcome to the third totalitarianism, and that is my criticism of politics of globalization and of United States of America. I think that liberalism is absolutely wrong, not because of liberalism, but because of modernity. Because modernity, was liberal from the beginning. It was not so clear from the beginning that individualism will win finally over socialism or nationalism, but now it is clear. And that was individualistic roots of the Western modernity. That is wrong. That the concept of the man, of the human being as an individual is wrong. So I'm trying to challenge that, trying to propose alternative anthropology in order to fight against liberalism. And if liberals who are prevailing in the modern world judge me most dangerous philosopher, for me it is a pleasure.
Men will be farther removed from the divine and the spiritual. The Great War proved that humanity must progress upwards towards higher ideals. But then appeared that curse which was seen and felt by Christ, the Apostle John, Buddha, the first Christian martyrs, Dante, Leonardo da Vinci, Goethe, and Dostoevsky. It appeared, turned back the wheel of progress, and blocked our road to the divinity. Revolution is an infectious disease, and Europe, making the treaty with Moscow, deceived itself and the other parts of the world. The Great Spirit put at the threshold of our lives Karma, who knows neither anger nor pardon. He will reckon the account, whose total will be famine, destruction, the death of culture, of glory, of honor, and of spirit, the death of states, and the death of peoples. I see already this horror, this dark, mad destruction of humanity.